Good. Good morning. It's nice to see you, and I appreciate the opportunity to spend a few minutes with you this morning. The title that I originally planned for today is called From Radical to Reflective to Redemptive. And there's a subtitle called Working on Race and a Charged Climate. So part of my background is that I teach at the University of Colorado at the Denver campus. And my work is specifically focused on issues of race as they intersect with other sort of issues that our society contends with on a pretty regular basis. And so you got a session description that was pretty lengthy, and I won't read it, but presumably you've read it already. And let me just say, the way that I think my time will go today will be closer to this, right? So I don't think in a straight line, and I don't communicate very well in a straight line, and so I just want to invite you to join me on a journey today. And the journey that I have in mind is a journey where I'll start with trying to make a case for why all movements that are justice-oriented are intersectional by nature and by default. And if we're not thinking intersectionally, there's a really good chance that we will leave people behind. And to be sort of generous but also fairly honest, when I look across the room, I notice that there are lots of people who are missing. And so later on this morning, I'm going to ask you all to think about who you perceive are the missing voices in this room, the perspectives that we need. Again, this is a journey. For some of you, it'll feel just like that image on the screen. My bad. And if there's some things that I say that you want to talk about, some questions that linger for you, like comedians say, I'll be here all weekend. So you can pull me over when I'm getting more coffee and we can talk a little bit. I took some time to look at the SSDP website, and I saw that there were some core values. And I'm going to highlight 3 of them, but I'll read through the entire list. Shared power and authority, youth-controlled agenda, collaboration and partnership, constituent-specific strategies, learning, and diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. The 3 that I'm particularly interested in are collaboration and partnership. So what does it mean to sort of work collaboratively, to be a partner, not just an individual partner with the person who's standing beside, behind, before you? But how do you work collaboratively as a partner organization engaged in joint effort to combat all forms of injustice, including the one that brings you all here this weekend? Learning. Education is my background, and I will say that learning and development are 2 very different phenomena, 2 very different things. Learning being sort of in some ways the acquisition of information that manifests itself through different practice, and development having to do with sort of growing over time and becoming a different person through things like experiences. So I think that's relatively important, and I'm going to try and bring some attention to that this morning. And then lastly, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. And let me say that those are very powerful words. They are really centrally situated in my professional life, in my work, and my identity. But I will also say about the term inclusion is that it can really feel like a slippery slope. In a lot of ways, inclusion just means how do you get somebody from the margins into the center without necessarily changing the center aside from adding new people. And inclusion cannot be the goal, because inclusion still maintains a status quo of central identity and behavior and practice. And so I want to try and disrupt some of that today, just to invite you to think with me about what does it mean to develop and integrate and embed a racial lens in your efforts to eliminate the war on drugs. Now, I have to say, because I think it's important for me to point this out. Yesterday when Betty, who's your executive director, who I think is a really fascinating person, when she was giving her opening comment, yeah, that's right, that's good. When Betty was giving her opening comments yesterday, one of the things she said is, you should know who your people are. And so that to me was an invitation to think. In this room, of faces I've never seen before, I needed to think about, and still do, in the context of SSDP and the 2019 conference, who are my people? Who are the people with whom I connect? And whose people am I? And from my perspective, this discussion about joining and working together and belonging and doing that in a way that's intended to change systemic injustices does require some deep thinking about who do we belong to? And what does it mean to belong? And how do we demonstrate that through our practices? Now, I don't know if you all remember, but yesterday during the panel discussion, one of the things that Chile said was, there's a quote on the Just Leadership USA website. You may remember this. And the statement is, those who are closest to the problem are also those who are closest to the solution. Do you all remember that? Cool. There's some different manifestations of that same sort of thinking, right? So with great power comes great responsibility. To whom much is given, much is required. People like cats, so I put a cat picture up there because it makes people happy. There are also some additional thinkers who ask the same question about sort of responsibility in a context of power and oppression and domination. One of those is a brilliant thinker by the name of Bell Hooks. And what Bell Hooks states is love being her primary orientation as a feminist scholar. Love is a combination of care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust. And I wonder today where love, or what is the role of love in this context? Where is love situated? How does it motivate your actions? And not love for self, that's important, but love for others, love for your neighbor, love for strangers, love for the other. And then there's a really popular song called Fight the Power. I won't tell you how old I am, but let me say I was in elementary school when this song came out. And one of the statements in that song is, our freedom of speech is freedom or death. We've got to fight the powers that be. And then they say, let me hear you say fight the power. And there's a whole chorus, and it's really moving. And if you listen to it, you cannot help but like rock and snap and all of that stuff. But the claim that our freedom of speech is freedom or death also recognizes that there are tremendous dynamics of power when we're listening to the voices of people who are historically marginalized and oppressed, help guide the way that we think about the society that we are in right now. For some of us, discussions about policing, discussions about inclusion and belonging, discussions about power and oppression and marginalization are life or death. And I don't mean to make light of that, but here's some inherent tensions in the things that I'm going to invite you to think about today. One of those is ideology versus pragmatism. What do I believe versus what do I do? Those are tenuous points. And if I'm honest with myself, and maybe this is true for some of you, if I think about what I genuinely believe and will say on spot when I'm asked a question about what I believe, and then I look at my lifestyle and behavior, there's still some developing for me to do so that my practice aligns better with my beliefs. There's often tension between our ideologies and our habits. There's some tensions between our intellect, what we believe, and our emotions, what we feel, how our body viscerally responds to events and to stimuli and to prompts. There's some tensions between what belongs to us as human beings, as individuals, and our responsibility, but also with the system that we participate in. And I heard quite a bit yesterday of vocalizing the fact that we've got to be systemically aware, and that is absolutely true. And we also have to be individually aware and reflective also. Fourth, none of this is about blame or shame. So let me say, I don't know you. And often in conversations in a generally broad population of people, many of whom can be described as white, whether you identify that way or not, maybe you'd be perceived that way, there can often be a sense of this is about me and you're blaming me and saying that I'm responsible for systemic injustice. And let me say that is not at all the case. What I will say is I will ask you, just as I try to practice myself, to think about how I am participating, maybe benefiting from the same systems that I say that I want to dismantle, possibly because I believe that it gives me some status or clout or capital to say I'm anti-X, Y, or Z, and I'm working to dismantle these particular systems. And saying that I do that gives me a group to whom I can belong, even if there's some contradictions between my sort of vocalized commitments and my practices, as I mentioned before. So please know that this isn't about any individual person in the room except for me, and I'm just going to talk about my own thoughts and ask you to hear my thoughts and think about whether or not you share any of the thoughts that I'm going to share with you today. I know that the answers are not easy. They're not intended to be easy. Injustice is coded in our legal code, as you all are very much aware of, but there are some intersectional points where our legal code also has marginalized human beings for other reasons than their sort of participation with drugs and such. I do want to say if you have a reaction to an issue, that's just an opportunity to explore and to think, because our goal is to shift realities, to change the way that our system works, to do that beginning with ourselves. Peter Senge, in his book, The the Fifth Discipline Field Book, he makes this series of claims in a logic model. What he says is, we are often captive to self-generating beliefs, and many of those are untested. These beliefs are based on conclusions which are inferred from what we observe, combined with our own past experiences. So we can self-generate beliefs and conclusions. Those may go untested, but our lives manifest the fact that we have beliefs that come from conclusions that we've drawn or that have been handed to us, combined with our own experiences. And his encouragement to us, my encouragement to myself and to you, is that we take the time to look at these conclusions that we've drawn. And then he says we operate under a series of assumptions. Our beliefs are true. I believe it, and therefore it is true. The truth is obvious. If you all saw what I saw, then you know that I was right, because I am, after all, right. I've seen this. I know what it looks like. I know what it feels like. I know what it sounds like. The truth is fundamentally obvious. Our beliefs are based on real data. However, the data that we rely on are the data that we select. So rather than having a broad enough view of how people experience an injustice system in our society that is informed by conversations with multiple persons, his suggestion is that we sometimes arrive at conclusions simply through the lens of our own experience. And I've learned about myself, I just haven't seen enough of the world, and I simply don't know enough. Now, I'll say one other thing about this before I move on. Yesterday, when I was thinking about this idea that Betty shared about knowing who your people are, I experienced a tremendous tinge of sort of guilt and not belonging. And the reason for that is this. I, as a black man in the U.S., haven't been incarcerated. I've never failed a class. Don't know what other stereotypes are that float around our society about people who look like me and fit my presence or the way that I'm showing up for you all today. I am the child of a single-parent household. My mother was unemployed. I have two brothers. We have different dads. One of them has a different father. My mom we were on welfare and that sort of thing. And my mom was spent quite a bit of her time addicted to various kinds of drugs. And on at least 2 occasions when I was in middle school, had to resuscitate 2 people who overdosed in the room before they came out so that we wouldn't know. So there was a degree of distance from them, but in terms of my own experience, there are many molds about perceptions of black men like myself that I simply do not fit. In fact, I've been married since I was 25. I've known my wife since we were in the 5th grade. I have 2 children who look like they belong in storybooks, and they're really, really bright children. I don't actually belong in a space like this because what I believe about the relationship of sort of my race to the historical war on drugs and its targeting of people of color has not been a part of my experience. It doesn't mean that I actually don't belong. It just means that it takes me a while to figure out, what do I have to say to a group like you? And all I can tell you today is I will give my best. Now, at times today, you'll hear me make references to various sort of scholars because I think I work in higher education. And in my professional life, there's no way to really establish legitimacy unless you situate yourself and your thoughts and your work in a context of someone else's work. So another scholar that I want to refer to today is a gentleman by the name of Carey Daly, who writes about how to do qualitative research. And I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm a social scientist. And here's a variation on what Carey Daly writes. When we do academic work, we strive for reasoned explanation, representational accuracy, and something called certainty, the sense that we are right. When we do art, we strive for arousal, vividness, and interpretive creativity. When we do qualitative research, we do science and art. And I'm going to suggest that when we do organizing work, which I am involved with, it is a combination of science and art. How do you wake people up to an issue and get them to see it for its own merits through their own lenses and informed by their own experiences, but combine that with reliable things like data. Thus, we must manage the paradox of inclination and cultivate the need for welcoming the unexpected. We must think and we must feel if we want to understand the world and transcend our immediate context. I want to try and come back to this idea of immediate context in just a little while. one of the things that I'm supposed to try and convince you of today, and I'm just not sure how I'm going to do it. So I'm going to look at the floor so I can focus on my own words and not your reactions to my words. I'm going to say that one of the reasons that race matters in a conversation about eliminating war on drugs, as I think you all are very much aware of, is the fact that target populations are socially constructed. There are entire realms of social science that have to do with identifying groups of people who need intervention, identifying groups of people who have a social illness or a pathology and need to be rescued from that. And very often those people happen to be people of color. In other cases, those are people who are differently abled. In other contexts, those are people who are non-male. In many cases, the social construction of target populations has to do with defining other human beings based on their non-whiteness, non-maleness, non-straightness, non-Protestant practice, non-middle class beliefs, values, and behaviors. Social construction of target populations is an entire field. And I will say, sort of in my estimation of where we are as a society, race is a tremendous, important, lasting, historical, socially constructed target population that drives policy, that drives legislation, that drives housing, that drives lots of things, including this discussion that you all are having this weekend about the war on drugs. And when I mean socially constructed, here's what I mean. You all may know this. I just like to use this as an example, and it makes me feel at ease because I think it's hilarious. You may not, but I think it's hilarious, and here it is. Social construction simply means that we've built it, we've made it up, we agreed to it, and then we depend on it. If I were to ask you all by saying it out, like, what does the color red mean? Some of you may say stop. It doesn't mean stop. It just means that when you're on the road and you see the color red, then you stop driving. Yellow doesn't mean slow down. Green doesn't mean go. Those colors don't mean anything. But we agree as a society that when you see this color, then you're supposed to behave according to the signal that the color is attempting to convey to you. Because we live in a society where that's what we've agreed to. That's the way that we live. And not unlike the use of colors to determine human behavior on things like the highway and the road and the boulevard or wherever it is that people drive cars these days, similar to that, race as a social construction in our society signals to us things like status and value and wealth and worth and belonging and those sorts of things. Here are a couple of quotes that I want you to have. The Sentencing Project describes it this way. By increasing support for punitive policies, racial perceptions of crime have made sentencing more severe for all Americans. The U.S. has the world's highest imprisonment rate, with 1 in 9 people serving life sentences. Racial perceptions of crime, combined with other factors, have led to the disparate punishment of people of color. Although blacks and Latinos together comprise just 30% of the general population, they account for 50% of the prison population, and the war on drugs is one of the most significant contributors to that disparity. But in this room, when I look around, there's another disparity that has to do with where else are the folks of color who are also interested in this topic who don't happen to be participating in this conference this weekend. And I can't tell you why. I'm just saying that you should also wonder about the why. According to the NAACP, if current racial incarceration trends continue, 1 in 3 black males born today can expect to spend time in prison during their lifetime. And there's been little and quite muted outrage at the prospect that unless things change, 1/3 of black men will be incarcerated during their lives. That's really, really staggering. 2 black men are in my household. I've got a 13-year-old son who'll be 14 in 5 weeks. If the 2 of us don't make it, that means don't get incarcerated. That means that the statistics show that my neighbor probably will. I should feel a sense of sort of outrage and discomfort about that. Luis held up a sign that said 1 minute. I thought, shit, it's been 45 minutes already. It hasn't. Combahee River Collective. So that helps me to relax. I thought I was screwing up. I mentioned in the sort of beginning that one of the things that we sort of have responsibility to do is think about how we can think intersectionally, think about how issues overlap, are related to one another. And if you know the history of the literature of intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a critical legal scholar, who's connected to the critical race theory movement in the US over the past 30 or so years, developed the term intersectionality to represent that people who come from multiply oppressed backgrounds, so based on gender, language, race, ability, et cetera, face a different kind of oppression because it's not a one-off issue. That to be black, in her example, to be black is to be oppressed because of perception in society. To be female is to be oppressed, to be based on perception in society, and that to be black and female isn't the same as having one or the other of those, but it's a different kind of oppression and marginalization. That sort of thinking actually has a bit more history. This actually was produced the same year that I was born, and there was a group of black lesbian feminists who came up with a manifesto or a treatise. It's 15 pages, so I have just a few points about this that I'm going to ask you to think about, because I think it's also quite fascinating. Here's what they write. We are committed, or actively committed, to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class privilege, and see as our particular task the development of integrated, really important term, analysis and practice, based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. Right? So there's some powerful words in this statement. One of those is actively. We are actively committed to struggling, and the recognition that the major systems of oppression in our society are interlocking, are interdependent, are not isolated. In fact, their suggestion is in order to eliminate any forms of oppression and marginalization, our thinking has to be systemic, not simply about our own experiences, not about our individual interests, not about our individual needs and goals. But our thinking has to also be about the systems that we're attempting to eliminate, eradicate, change, reverse, et cetera, recreate. And they have four other points. They're not minor points. None of this document is minor. But there are four other points that I want to highlight sort of in the context of this notion that major systems of oppression are interlocking, and I just want to give you an opportunity to enjoy, to appreciate their analysis. They say, in the practice of our politics, we do not believe that the end always justifies the means. Many reactionary, destructive acts have been done in the name of achieving correct political goals. As feminists, we do not want to mess over people in the name of politics. Third, we believe in collective process and a non-hierarchical distribution of power within our own group and in our vision of a revolutionary society. And lastly, we are committed to a continual examination of our politics as they develop through criticism and self-criticism as an essential aspect of our practice. A lot of this statement really reminds me just of what I've heard yesterday in the plenary session that many of you were here for, and in my conversations with Betty and Stacia, and as Luis mentioned, Luis, Hannah, and Logan. A lot of what happens is already in the minds of SSDPers, and SSDP as a full organization is reminiscent to me of what the Combahee River Collective set out to analyze and think about back in 1977. It is this last statement that I want to just restate, and then I'll move on to the next slide. We are committed to a continual examination of our politics as they develop through criticism and self-criticism as an essential aspect of our practice. And I just want you to think for a minute about what do you perceive to be the meaning of the term self-criticism in this context, in the context of this slide, in the context of this statement. Not just criticism of others and sort of the ways in which the system is attacking us, but what does self-criticism look like for you and feel like for you and sound like? What does it mean to be reflective of yourselves, upon yourselves and your actions and your behaviors? Now, one of the things I've learned about SSDP is that you all have sort of a chapter structure where you all are participating, many of you, in chapters at your local colleges. This idea of self-criticism seems really, really relevant in terms of asking you to think about how do you reflect on the ways in which your chapter is pursuing eliminating the war on drugs? And is that happening through collaboration and partnership, which is a core value, or is that happening through some other means, such as here's what we've decided to focus on, and so here's what we're going to do, and if people want to join us, so be it. Self-criticism means that we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to the larger effort to dismantle oppression that's systemic in our society. We owe it to ourselves to consider the ways in which we're either inviting or not inviting other human beings to join a cause that is even larger than the issue that is at hand. Here's some things that I think are important, and I won't read all of these, but I've mentioned the term intersectionality before. Anti-racism seems important. It's on your website, and racism also is important because you can't be anti-nothing, right? So racism is a thing. Anti-racism is presumably the opposite of that thing. The presumption of diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism as the core value means that there is also some awareness that racism is an actual phenomenon, and not practicing racism is important to the organization. Anti-racism is a core value. My wondering for you all is, how is it that you're practicing anti-racism in the ways in which you demonstrate the work of eliminating the war on drugs through your chapter work? How are you practicing that? Bella Banathy wrote, 1996, about how to think about systems and how to create new systems, essentially meaning that our job isn't just to end something, it's to also build something new. And I'm going to try and connect this in just a little while to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community idea, this notion that we're supposed to transcend and build what we want to see rather than just tear down what we disagree with. But Bella Banathy writes this: even if people fully develop their potential, they cannot give direction to their lives, they cannot forge their destiny, they cannot take charge of their future unless they also develop the competence to take part directly and authentically in the design of the systems in which they live and work. I'm sorry. Unless they also develop the competence to take part directly and authentically in the design of the systems in which they live and work and reclaim their right to do so. This is what true empowerment is about. And Banathy argues in this same text that most of the systems in our society were built in the 19th century during an industrial era that is no longer valid or relevant because we don't live in an industrial society anymore. But the way that our legal system is set up, the role of police officers in our society, war on drugs, war on poverty, war on single parents, all of the various versions of symbolic wars that we have in our society are also based during this same era. And his suggestion is that we've got to build something new rather than just tear something down. Back in November, I went to this place. It's in Atlanta. It's the MLK thing. I was going to say memorial, but yes. Center and memorial. Has anyone been there before? So Dr. King is buried here on the left. His wife, Coretta Scott King, is buried on the right. That's their tomb. Their remains are in there. And one of the fascinating things about Dr. King that I think is worth mentioning is that he is known for these principles of nonviolence. And I just want to read what they are because I think there's something beautiful in all of these, but a couple that are worth highlighting. One is nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. 2, nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. 3, seeks to defeat injustice, not people. 4, holds that suffering can educate and transform people and society. Suffering can educate and transform people and society. His suggestion is that there is something valuable to be learned from those who suffer. And in the context of developing a racial analysis as a part of dismantling the war on drugs and as a part of maintaining a chapter structure in SSDP, my wondering for you all is, which kinds of suffering are you aware of and do you use to both educate and transform your practice? 5, nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. Here's this word again that Bell Hooks used. And 6, believes that the universe is on the side of justice. So if you know Dr. King's legacy, these are really important principles around which his studying with Mohandas Gandhi and a couple of other really important scholars, this is evidence of his sort of legacy. I'm not asking you to read that. I'll tell you what I did with it, though. So this is a statement of the beloved community. One of the things that Dr. King sort of aspired to that I think is good for all of us to also aspire to is this idea that we can build the kind of world that we want to see through relationships that transcend the status quo. And so I typed this whole thing up because I thought, I like this photo, but you probably can't see it. And so then I highlighted the stuff that I thought were key. And there were just a lot of it. So then I underlined some key phrases and just cut it in half. And so then I distilled it to these points. We need to have a realistic vision of an achievable society. Realistic and achievable. Caring and compassion drive political parties that support the worldwide elimination, policies rather. Let me start over because it's not political parties. Caring and compassion drive political policies that support the worldwide elimination of poverty and hunger and all forms of bigotry and violence. This notion of eliminating forms of bigotry and violence, in my estimation, is why you all are here this weekend. How do we eliminate forms of bigotry and violence that manifest themselves in a codified, historical, systematized, and systemic war on drugs? And lastly, it transcends boundaries and barriers and embraces all of creation. Right. Realistic, achievable, eliminating, but also transcending and embracing. Ending a thing in this particular context is a small part of a larger context that is about building and constructing and dreaming and envisioning and pursuing. A goal that can be accomplished through courage and determination. That's another statement from that same document. So here's some things that I want you to consider. What is it that you consider yourself building? Not what are you ending, but what are you building? I know that you know what you're ending. I've heard many of you talk about it. But individually, as a person involved in this conference thinking about the war on drugs, in addition to ending that, what are you hoping to build? What are your materials for building? Bell Hooks said that the primary material is love, a sense of connectedness, a sense of compassion, a sense of indebtedness to other human beings and their survival and their thriving and their well-being. But what are the materials that you believe help you to build? In an organization that has a core value of collaboration and partnership, if you were to make a list of the people, not those that you currently are working with, that's an easy sort of first level answer to this question about who are your partners. But beyond those with whom you already are in relationship and are already working, who are the potential partners in helping you to build whatever it is that you've envisioned in your own head? And if you haven't formed in your own mind a vision of what you want to build, what kind of society you are hoping for, well, now's a chance for you to think about that. Whoops. And lastly, is that adequate? Are the materials that you have in mind to build the society that you hope to build adequate? I'll say about myself, knowing what the right materials are to build are really, really difficult. Back in 2014, I worked with some colleagues to develop a middle school. I'm not from Denver, but I've been in Denver since 2002. I'm actually from Virginia, and I've been living in Denver since 2002. And in 2014, I worked with 4 colleagues from the university, a middle school teacher, and a group of people from the community, from communities in Denver, to design a civic engagement middle school, believing that the goal of education is to help children identify and respond to the problems of the 21st century, not simply to do well academically. That's important to me professionally. And so we spent some time developing a middle school. And it was a good experience, and we had our middle school approved. But it wasn't enough. Because the notion in my community, in my city, the city that I'm here from, it's not mine, but the city that I come here from, in that city, we talk often about like rights and justice. It's a fairly liberal left-leaning context. But the idea that we would train middle school students through a learning experience to identify when water is not working in a school, when there are potholes on the street, when they can't get to their school because there are too many railroad tracks and there isn't a bridge, because the city hasn't decided that building a bridge over 8 sets of railroad tracks so that children can walk to school was a priority. It wasn't enough for us to change the minds of decision makers simply because we had an idea that worked. In my experience, knowing whether or not what it is that you're trying to build, who are your partners, but also wondering whether or not that's going to be adequate seems like it's really also particularly important. One of the things I learned in my conversations with Logan and Luis and Hannah over the last several months is that organizing is actually broader than just a couple of particular activities, right? Like one of the things I learned from Logan was that organizing also means creating a space for people to be fully who they are in a context in which they're not asked to simply leave that on the shelf for something else. Now, I'm not saying that this is about right or wrong. I'm saying that this is about sort of ideological tensions and pragmatic tensions, as I mentioned before, and recognizing also that creating a space that is open and welcoming for all kinds of human beings, and also knowing if there are people who are disparately impacted by the war on drugs, then they also should be in the conversations that we're having about attempting to build something, and we should feel a sense of sort of sadness or loss or worry if we don't invite those people in and create ramps and bridges for them to join our work. So here are a couple of recommendations that I have in asking you to think about this. And I'll tell you why I think this is important in just a little while. The title of this talk is supposed to be From Radical to Reflective to Redemptive. And I had an original plan when I started off that was about, I'm going to show you some stats because people love stats. And I'm going to show you some tables and spreadsheets because people love tables and spreadsheets. But I don't, and they make my head hurt. So rather than that, I thought I'd show you some pictures and then ask you some questions. I've already shown you the pictures. But here are the questions. The term radical means root cause. It doesn't mean doing something courageous. At its root, it means root cause. So to do a radical analysis means that we have to be looking at what is giving rise to this phenomenon that we see ahead of us. And here are a couple of questions that I think are worth thinking about for just a little while. One of those is, who benefits from the way things are and who does not? That is not an unfamiliar question probably to anyone in this room. And another is, which target populations are socially constructed and which values do these target populations embody? In addition to thinking about sort of the root causes of why there's a war on drugs and how people are disproportionately impacted by this war on drugs, but also thinking about, well, why are people missing from the room? Why aren't there more people of color involved in this really important work that SSDP has been going after for more than 20 years? What do we need to do to ensure those who are closest to the problem are part of the work of solving this same problem? What do we need to do for that? So these questions on being reflective are intended to ask you to think this through a bit. How do I respond to the different values and priorities that people from diverse racial, cultural, and ethnic backgrounds bring to the work that I'm involved in? And if people of color, particularly Black and Latinx, have been historically targeted by the war on drugs, most often evident in their families and local communities, how does my participation reflect awareness of that reality? And then lastly, the space that we occupy together, the space that you all get a chance to create because you all, in your chapter level work and in your relationships with other SSDPers, are creating a space that belongs to you. My question is, how do you make that space redemptive and transformative and welcoming and inviting? And two of these kinds of questions are, through what habits are we practicing responsiveness to people's different, sometimes conflicting needs for belonging, transformation, healing, camaraderie, productivity, fun? How are we doing that? And lastly, given the chapter structure, is there a role for coalition building with other campus or community organizations also engaged in achieving justice for those from marginalized backgrounds? In sum, my point is this. When I began conversations with several members of SSDP who've already been named, the question that I had in the back of my mind, that I still have both in the back and the front of my mind, is what is the role of sort of racial justice as a component in ending the war on drugs? And I just want to ask you to think about the same thing. Because maybe you'll think, you know, Antwan, I'm glad that you're wrapped up. I'm not convinced. That's cool. Because my goal isn't to convince you. My goal is to simply ask you to think about what I'm thinking about. If we learn from the Combahee River Collective that the major systems of oppression are interlocking, and if you believe that's true, then where are the points of interlocking systems of oppression that you are paying attention to rather than the one that brought all of you here? If they are truly interlocking, if they're intersectional, if they are interdependent, codependent, co-occurring, what are the other systems that you're paying attention to? And how? And how does that inform your work? From my perspective, the one system of oppression that also has to be included in the dialogue around things like systemic oppression and marginalization through the sort of legal code in our country is race. I have a personal interest in racial justice, but I also recognize that across our society, there are connections to race and racial oppression and racial marginalization across the board. How are we paying attention to the ways in which these different systems are working together, and what does that mean for our work and our language and our activities and our building and our partnerships and collaboration. Last thing I'll say is this. One of the products of my conversations with Hannah and Luis and Logan and Betty over the past several months, we've been working on developing a tool that we hope will be useful to you as an SSD peer that allows you some targeted time to think about all the different, not all, many of the different interlocking systems that have led to oppression that are related to the war on drugs directly or indirectly. I don't believe, and I think this is true, that the war on drugs can be ended without the involvement of others who are also really close to the problem. Relatives and family members, absolutely. Other students on campus, absolutely. But people of color who are in the communities outside of your campus, who are also doing really important work about education and employment and transportation, those are important to include as well. So one of the things that you'll get from Betty, who's coming up right now, which means it's probably time for me to wrap up. There's Betty. One of the things that you're going to get from Betty in an email, probably before the conference is over, is an electronic version of this document that we've been working on that is intended to give you a chance to reflect, a chance to discuss, and a chance to explore as a chapter, as an individual, and as an organization on the whole, a chance to explore what would it mean for us to develop a racial analysis in the context of our efforts to end the war on drugs. And one of the underlying questions of that is, and what will you build in its place? Thank you.